Aloha. Did you love Hawaii? Amazing. Now we just have to revel in that wonderfulness, the beauty that we all soaked in, the culture that we all soaked in. Well, thank you for coming this morning. Today we're going to talk about a very, very important story, a folk story, a story from the present, a story that will be told for generations upon generations, and we lived during the time in which it happened. It's an amazing story. I'm so excited to share with you. We're going to talk about the great Polynesian navigators. The colonization of the Pacific Islands is one of the greatest human adventure stories of all time. Has anyone seen the movie Moana? Yeah, fantastic story. It's the story of this folk story that I'm about to share with you, one that you've taken part in. Thousands of years ago, when most European sailors were still hugging the coast, the island peoples of the Pacific held the knowledge and skills to explore the great ocean paths around and beyond their homes. Modern instruments didn't exist. No compasses, no radio, no radar, no GPS. The Pacific peoples navigated their canoes with their own sophisticated techniques, using the seas, the skies, and sea life to guide them. Now, the world's largest cruise ship holds almost 7,000 passengers. We're cruising on a 983-foot-long vessel, guided by computers. They don't use charts on the bridge. Everything's done by satellite. Nobody even driving right now. Yeah, nobody has to drive the ship. That's the number one question people ask the captain. Who's driving? Nobody. The computers. Lots of technology. We don't even have to use charts anymore unless there's an emergency. They're stacked away in a drawer. But before that, the great Polynesian navigators used Stone Age technology. They built voyaging canoes capable of traveling thousands of miles and set forth against the winds and the currents to find tiny dots of land in the midst of the largest ocean on earth. And having found them, they traveled back and forth again and again to settle them. All this 500 to 3,000 years ago. This is known as the Polynesian Triangle, where the Polynesians traveled. This encompasses that area. Polynesia consists of thousands of islands stretching from New Zealand, down here, in the southwest, over 8,000 kilometers to Easter Island, to the southeast, and north to the Hawaiian Islands. This area of the Pacific Ocean, encompassing Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia, is known as Oceania. Now, it's thought that the Hawaiians had their origins from the Marquesas Islands at first, about 300 AD, and then the Tahitians, who traveled there between 600 and 1200 AD. Now, it's thought that the Polynesian forebears came from Southeast Asia, traveled down through Indonesia, ventured their way to Fiji and Tonga, then to Samoa, the Marquesas, where they flared out to all of the other islands, and then finally made their way north to Hawaii. Now, these are tiny, tiny little dots in the middle of the Pacific, so keep that in the back of your brain. For a long, long time, no one knew how this could be possible. How did they do that? How did they venture out to find these tiny specks of land? And why would you? And it was thought, based on logic and physics, because the prevailing currents came from South America across the Pacific, that the people of Polynesia must have come from South America. the trade winds blow that direction as well. So that made a lot of sense. Why would you sail against winds and currents? It's not logical. So in 1947, a Norwegian explorer and writer by the name of Thor Heyerdahl put together the Kon-Tiki expedition. And he built a raft out of native materials from South America and journeyed across the Pacific Ocean as he thought the Polynesians might have done. Heyerdahl, of course, believed that they came from South America and settled Polynesia during pre-Columbian times. He built the raft. It was kind of flimsy, and he did not have a good way of steering it. He thought, and he didn't have any maps. He wanted to just run into the islands and see if it would happen by happenstance, as he thought the Hawaiians and Polynesians found the island. Now, despite the current and wind trade wind theory, DNA analysis has provided us with the evidence to show that the inhabitants of these islands actually came from the west. Luckily, we have that technology now. Polynesians all share things in common, which shows a similar lineage. They have a similar language, all the different islands, if you're to travel across Polynesia. Similar foods. They imported them, of course, as they traveled. The taro, the breadfruit. Similar customs. They had status fixed by lineage, clans versus individuals. Slavery was very common. They practiced polygamy, human sacrifice, and rule by divine power. But one thing is for sure, they were very determined travelers. Again, we don't know why you would leave and travel across the Pacific, dangerous journeys to find maybe nothing. But probably for the same reasons that we know our ancestors did, for a better life, right? Persecution from something, maybe famine or war. Those are usually the reasons that people leave perfectly good homes and try to go someplace else. Their journey was not easy. There was much trial and error. They didn't just go out on one trial and hit an island. They would go out and journey for a mile. Next time, go out for a couple miles. Third time, go out 4 or 5 miles. Over generations, this happened, eventually leading to the exploration and the founding of a new island. The Marquesans are thought to arrive around 300 to 500 AD. This is based on radiocarbon dating of materials that have been found on the islands. The Tahitians arrived somewhere around the 1100s. They brought their crops, their gods, and their traditions. And Hawaiian culture and Tahitian culture are extremely similar. They share a very old history together. It's very evident when you look at their folk tales, their gods, their foods, their words, their chants. And by 1200, all of the Polynesian islands were inhabited by seafaring people that bravely navigated the Pacific to find them. By 1200. They had even visited the Americas by then. And we know this because South American sweet potato is in Hawaii and in Polynesia. It's from South America. And the word for sweet potato in South America is kumar. The word in Polynesia is kuumala. The Chumash Indians of California shared a culture with the Polynesians. It's shown that they have similar ways of, actually identical ways of making hooks, of lashing canoes, and they actually share DNA as well. So these Polynesians made it all the way to the Americas. They started from scratch wherever they landed, building their homes, adapting to new environments, using the old ways and inventing new ways of doing things. Introducing their traditional crops to the islands, bringing with them, of course, what they knew because they didn't know what they were going to find there. So they brought things that they knew would make the journey and be able to plant when they arrived. And once settled, they turned their attention to everyday matters, to basic survival. They became skilled coastal sailors, rarely venturing out of sight of land. Instead of building large double-hulled voyaging canoes. They crafted vessels for sailing the shoreline waters, for fishing, and going between the islands. And this knowledge of long-distance navigation quickly faded. Once all the islands were settled, they lived in splendid isolation for about 600 years. No contact with the Western world, essentially living amongst themselves in Polynesia. Now, the Hawaiians practiced a subsistence lifestyle. They had no written language, but they did share petroglyphs with us, carvings and rocks, and they had a feudal society. This is one of the famous petroglyphs that you can see on the Big Island. Now, meanwhile, Europeans had not yet even found the Pacific Ocean. The first European expeditions known in the South Pacific were in the late 1500s. Explorers such as Magellan, Tasman, Bougainville, and Cook reached Polynesia in the years stretching from the 1500s to the 1800s. Spanish sailor Pedro Fernandez de Queiroz wrote in 1595, "These inhabitants must have drifted here by accident because of the course against the wind and currents." So he had come across the Pacific, and he said, there's no way these savages, as it was quoted many times in the writings of explorers, could have figured out how to cross this ocean against winds and currents. Magellan arrived in 1595 in Polynesia. Bougainville arrived in 1766 in Tahiti. And of course, the famous voyage of Captain Cook to Venus Island in 1764. If you do not know the story of longitude, we didn't even know how to sail using longitude until this voyage was taken. This was the first test of a clock that could cross the oceans and keep perfect time with England. Because as you know, if you need to calculate longitude, you need a place of origin which to do so. Anybody here a sailor? A couple of people, okay. So all these explorers, and especially the Polynesians, they had no latitude nor longitude. But the greatest explorers of all time crossed the world with no measurement of where they were on it. Pretty amazing. Now, Captain Cook writes about the Polynesians. He picked up a Polynesian navigator, probably stole a Polynesian navigator, when he was in Tahiti. His name was Tupaya. And there's writings about Tupaya. Captain Cook found him most interesting because given any particular moment during the day, he could ask Tupaya as they traveled around the Pacific. He eventually took him to New Zealand when he found New Zealand. He could ask Tupaya, "Where is your home?" And Tupaya could point back to Tahiti because he was keeping a chronological map in his head, which is required of a navigator to know where he was. But Cook was convinced that among the Polynesians, the navigators were capable of guiding canoes over great distances. He saw their skill. He saw what they were capable of in this young Tupaya, this young navigator. Various European powers, including Spain, Great Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and the United States, all colonized most of Polynesia eventually. And today, most Polynesian islands are independent nations or territories or states of Europe and America. So here are the flags of Oceania. Captain Cook first landed in Kauai, in the Hawaiian Islands, in 1778. The Big Island, January 1779. And many of you probably visited the memorials where he landed and made contact with Hawaiians for the first time. This event, however, was to change Hawaii forever. Nothing bigger than the landing of Captain Cook probably had more impact in the Hawaiian Islands than the Hawaiians arriving there themselves. So the Westerners brought with them Western things: clothing, animals, metal, nails to build things with, and of course, guns and ammunition. Clothing as well, which was something that really wasn't prominent in Polynesia. Captain Cook, unfortunately, was killed later on that year, February the 14th, in Kealakekua Bay in Kona. Many of you probably snorkeled in that bay where this fight ensued. It was over a misunderstanding, and Cook was killed. Many of his sailors were able to escape with the ship. From that time, as I explained in another show, King Kamehameha at that time was just a ruler of a small village. But as a young boy, he had had a dream about being a ruler at one time of all the Hawaiian Islands. And the coming of the Westerners, the coming of this ammunition and guns and gunpowder made that possible. Kamehameha amassed an army of 800 canoes, collected these weapons, and eventually took over all of the Hawaiian Islands, becoming King Kamehameha the Great. From 1790 to 1819, he was a wise and industrious ruler. Now, I want you to keep track of the timeline here. Okay, 1779, Captain Cook was killed. 1779. Think about what was happening in the United States mainland at that time. We'd just gotten our independence. King Kamehameha becomes the king back to 1790 to 1819. He was a wise and industrious ruler. He saw the benefits of this Western technology, metals and nails and clothing, these things coming in, and saw the opportunity to be able to trade with these people who were coming through. Now, at this time, there were whaling ships that were headed up to Alaska. If you were on my Alaska cruise, you heard stories of the Civil War actually taking place, part of it in Alaska. They went up to burn some Yankee ships up there. So there were whaling ships in the Arctic. They were sailing around from New England, and they found the Hawaiian Islands as a stopping off point for rest, relaxation, and some resupply. As you know, Hawaii is the closest land to Hawaii, Alaska is the closest land to Hawaii if you're sailing straight lines. So King Kamehameha emphasized religious protocols, had many kapu, had many places of worship, put some structure into this civilization, of course, of the unified Hawaiian Islands. He increased trade with these people who were coming through, and in 1809 established Honolulu as a seat of government. Wow, that was really quick. Going from quote-unquote savages to being westernized and creating a seat of government in his unified Hawaii, learning from the Westerners. He then, of course, had sons and daughters who took over the monarchy from him, handed down generation to generation, until 1893. So now we're looking at 1779 to 1893. His daughter, Queen Liliuokalani, is reigning over Hawaii. Now, backtrack a little bit. In the 1820s, 1820, not very long after the unified Hawaiian Islands, missionaries arrived from New England. Amazing stories, sailing, these 17, 18-year-old preachers and their wives sailing down around the South American Horn, never having left their backyards before, having to been tied to the beds to keep them from hurting themselves, flailing around the ship in the rough waters. Amazing stories. Think about that every time we do this crossing. The people who did make it, or the people that had horrible travels across this Pacific Ocean, which can be very rough at sometimes. They showed up in the 1820s, and the face of Hawaii began to change. They came to do good, and they did very, very well. First, they started to farm. Of course, that's what they knew. They built churches, they started converting Christians, and they started farms. The first industry created in Hawaii was the sugarcane industry, which is now defunct. But it brought a lot of money, was able to employ a lot of people. They actually had to bring in laborers for this industry, not enough people to work. So they started going to China, the Philippines, Portugal, Japan bringing in workers to work in the fields. You might have noticed some of that culture in the food of Hawaii as you were eating your plate lunches. That all comes from these cultures. The Filipino, the Portuguese might have had Portuguese sausage in one of your plate lunches, or Japanese katsu chicken. Those plate lunches were created for the hungry field workers who needed all those carbs, that macaroni salad and that rice scoop that you got. Nobody needs that many carbs during the day unless you're working hard in the fields. So sugarcane was king, and they were making good money. Some of you probably remember that when you were younger, the sugarcane commercials on TV from Hawaii, right? The sugar commercials. And then came pineapple, not from Hawaii, it's from South America. And it took a lot of agricultural scientists to figure out how to grow it in Hawaii. But once they did, it became the ruler of Hawaii, literally. So at this point, the largest landowners were descendants of the missionaries. And you became a landowner when there were enough missionaries now that had populated the Hawaiian Islands. And remember, Hawaiians didn't read or write. So they were learning to not practice Hawaiian, to speak English, to not practice their traditional customs, but to be converted to American Christianity. And there came a time in the town square where in order to register your land, you had to come down and write your name in the logbook. Well, Hawaiians didn't read or write, nor did they get the memos about writing down their lands in the logbook. So the Hawaiians were not the landowners, needless to say. And pineapple ruled, literally. So, from 1893 and 1900. 1893 was the year Queen Liliuokalani was the last of the monarchs of Hawaii. The landowners created a provincial government, right? They own all the land. They're, of course, getting together, having meetings, talking about development. So they created a government amongst themselves. A coup was set in motion. The Lolani Palace, you may have seen in Honolulu, was stormed, and Queen Liliuokalani was imprisoned, and Sanford Dole declared himself president of Hawaii. This was all created amongst the landowners. Grover Cleveland, the president of the United States, finds out about this and orders that the queen be released to undo this wrong, and that Dole is not president of Hawaii, but instead may be able to make some sort of seat for himself on city councils. Well, that wasn't going to happen. Dole refuses and waits out Cleveland's term. He was about to leave office. There was an election going on. And Dole convinces the new Congress to annex Hawaii, and Hawaii becomes a territory in 1900. Essentially, a coup took over the Hawaiian Islands. This changed Hawaii forever. The 1920s brought tourism, of course, to Hawaii. Steamships of people started coming over to visit this tropical paradise. This changed Hawaii forever. 1941, the infamous day, Pearl Harbor, that changed Hawaii forever. And in 1959, Hawaii becomes the 50th United State. This changed Hawaii forever. Hawaii became this. Hawaii became this. Hawaii became this. And this. The land that was cultivated with crops for subsistence no longer existed. The Hawaiians were pushed into the margins, made to not speak their language anymore, practice their traditions anymore. Their mouths were cleaned out with chemicals in the schools if they spoke their Hawaiian language, made to speak English. Poverty, never before a part of Polynesian culture, became commonplace among Hawaiians. Never existed before. They weren't able to live the way they used to. They have lost their tradition, their way of life. And people who have lost their past become a lost people, says Herb Kane. In 1778, at the time that Captain Cook arrived, there were approximately 500,000 Hawaiians. 1922, after disease had wiped out most of the population, from the Westerners bringing smallpox, measles, mumps, all the diseases that we have on the mainland, 22,000 Hawaiians. By 1959, there were 12,000 Hawaiians. In the 1960s, there was unrest in America. We had a war going on, and the Hawaiians were starting to take notice of their situation and wanting to do something about it. At this time, a group of men got together, and the Polynesian Voyaging Society was founded, 1973, by these three men: nautical anthropologist Ben Finney, Hawaiian artist Herb Kane, and sailor Charles Tommy Holmes. These guys were Hawaiians. They were living in Hawaii, playing various roles, and they were feeling this angst, this loss of tradition, and they thought that they might be able to do something about it by bringing back something that had been lost. They created the Polynesian Voyaging Society. The three wanted to show that ancient Polynesians could have purposely settled the Polynesian Triangle using non-instrument navigation. The first Polynesian Voyaging Society project was to build a replica of a double-hulled voyaging canoe. No one had drawings or architecture of such a canoe. They just knew from stories that such a canoe existed, and that this might have been the way that they arrived in the Hawaiian Islands.
Pictures. The tiny Hokulea was the flagship of the Polynesian Voyaging Society, founded in 1973 in hopes of reviving the heartbeat of an almost forgotten Hawaiian culture.
Hokulea was a conduit for hope. It was a conduit for healing that goes back to the crushing of the Native Hawaiian people in the last 200 years. Hawaiian culture and language is pretty much by policy outlawed in the public schools in 1926. And most schools in Hawaii clearly understood, don't teach Hawaiian. It has no value. And you have that stereotype of Native Hawaiian, stupid, lazy, all that kind of stuff. I mean, you say it long enough, you're going to believe it, then you become it.
This enduring stereotype led academics to come up with a dismissive theory as to how Polynesian voyagers first reached the Hawaiian Islands.
They thought that Polynesians weren't great sailors, that they settled their islands by accident because their canoes weren't good enough and their navigation system accurate enough to purposely explore and settle Polynesia.
That needed to be shattered. And I think Hokulea, all of a sudden, was having the possibility to do that.
The Voyaging Society's mission was a bold one: to sail Hokulea to Tahiti and back, a voyage of over 5,000 miles. And she would cover the distance exactly like the first Polynesians did, navigating solely by the stars, the wind, and the waves.
One would argue that that canoe that landed on this sand in Hawaii that brought first of humankind to these islands could have been the greatest voyage of humankind. And that starts to shift how you start to think about who you are by knowing who you were and knowing where you come from.
We aren't just the servants of tourists. We're not just hula dancers smiling and loving to dance for you. We're an angry people. We're a warrior people. But there is no countervailing discourse, really, until the 1970s. And then you start to get it. You get it in the protest movements. You get it, right, in the building of the Hokulea and the daring act of sailing into the open ocean.
So who's going to navigate? This art form is lost. Doesn't exist anymore in Hawaii. Not sure if it even exists in Polynesia. So they set out, of course, to find some distant Polynesian somewhere in a small village that still knows how to do this. They find a guy. They find a guy in Tahiti. They write him a letter. Of course, it would take a long time to get there. They write him a letter. They never hear back from him. And they find out from a family member that sends a letter back that the ancient navigators, the way they would take themselves out, essentially, like the old iceberg theory of going out on an iceberg and floating away. But the old navigators would paddle out and not come back. And he had apparently just done that. So they'd just lost their last navigator, last Polynesian navigator known to exist. So who was going to carry out this journey? They didn't know. They had Herb's drawings from all the accounts that he could find. He had made drawings. They were going to build this from a drawing from an artist. So nobody who actually had ever built one or seen one before. So they found someone in Micronesia, Micronesian navigator Bao Hailug, from the Carolinian island of Satawal. Now, Mao was a master navigator. He was born in 1932, and by age 18, around the time the first American missionaries arrived also in Satawal, by middle age, he was concerned that no one else in Micronesia was going to be wanting to learn this ancient navigation. Everybody wanted to learn and get out of there, go to university in the United States. So he had no one to teach it to, and he was worried that this art would disappear if he had no one to pass it down to. So when contacted by the Hawaiians, he thought, well, this is a way for me to share. It's been passed down from generation to generation to me. This is a way for me at least to share it with someone else. So he agreed that he would come to Hawaii. He'd never left Satawal, of course, flew on a plane, come to Hawaii and train these young men to, one, sail, and that he would work with them to navigate, to make this ancient voyage to back to Tahiti. But he had one condition. That one condition, and if you're a sailor, you know that this must take place. You may sense it here on our ship, that everyone must work in unity, work together. You can see there's not a galley on this boat. There's no quarters to go retire in. You're all out there in the elements together. So in order to make this voyage, everyone would have to be a unit, to work as one. And he would be the commander to call out orders and directions, etc. They agreed. Now, it's very, very difficult for us to imagine this feat, but I want you to try to right now. Today, with our perceptions dulled by dependence on instruments, feats such as this based on a sensitivity which comes from living intimately with nature seems incredible. The only thing we might be able to liken this to is if you are a gardener or if you have a pet. You have a connection to that garden or to your animal. You can tell when it needs something if you are connected to it. It's not calling to you. It's not saying anything to you verbally, but you have a connection to it naturally. That's about the only thing we're connected to in nature nowadays. Feats such as this are impossible for our brains to wrap our heads around. Navigators were a brotherhood of experts, trained with acute powers of observation and memory. They were also priests responsible for conducting the rituals of their profession and invoking spiritual help. Whereas the modern navigator is equipped to fix his position without reference to his place of departure, the Polynesians used a system that was home-oriented. So you're always remembering where you just were. And in the open ocean, I don't know if you noticed, but there's no corners out there. So how do you do that? Always keeping a mental record of courses steered, all phenomena affecting the movement of the canoe, tracing these backwards in his mind so that at any time he can point to the approximate direction of his home island and estimate the sailing time required to reach it, a complex feat of dead reckoning. This requires careful attention and is also meant to give the navigator insufficient sleep, because you really can't doze off and be unconscious. You've got to have this mental awareness at all times. After the discovery of New Island, the altitude of stars passing overhead and the places on the horizon of the rising and setting stars would be carefully observed and incorporated into the lore, the chants, the stories of the navigators, and such knowledge would enable them to find the island again and again. I have to remind you that these explorations didn't take place one time. Hundreds of voyages away from a home island may have found them a new island. A generation or two may have lapsed before a new island was found. This was not a one-day, one-time thing like our ship. Keep that in the back of your brain. So how did they navigate? Using landmarks, of course. This is easy. Triangulation with line-of-sight objects. Navigating with star paths. This extremely complicated. Memorizing the rising and setting points of 220 stars and planets throughout the year, because it changes. When they see a familiar star or planet rise or set, they can tell which direction they're headed in. So there are zenith stars in the sky, one of them named Hokulea, or Arcturus, that they use to navigate, of course. In the southern hemisphere, it would be the Southern Cross. In the northern hemisphere, maybe the North Star, if you can see it, often dulled. Navigating by sea color and sighting a flotsam. Right? If we came through the giant Pacific garbage patch, we'd know where we were, thanks to all of us and our trash in the ocean. But of course, they didn't have that at this time. They were looking for debris from storms that had taken place on islands. Wispy clouds high in the sky meant bad weather off in the distance. Low-lying cumulus clouds meant stable conditions. Flotsam had to have come from somewhere, so read the currents. Follow that current, perhaps you may find land. Navigating with birds and cloud formations. Clouds piled up on the horizon, greenish colors on the bottoms of the clouds. Anybody notice that over the islands? The bottoms of the clouds were green. Very, very slight hint of green. And of course, birds. I've been watching for birds the entire time, watching where they showed up. Bird migrations across the Pacific. Right now, the TT, or the sooty shearwater, is navigating from the Arctic to New Zealand. We had many of them on board our ship during our voyage that I had to redirect back onto their flight path. But knowing that they fly every year back and forth would be something that would help you on your voyage. Of course, you can't fly as fast as a bird, but today you might follow their direction because you know they're headed to the Arctic. Well, that must be the northern regions of the planet. The golden plover migrates Alaska to the Pacific Islands, so they see these birds and figure out, hey, every March they're here. Maybe I can follow them back out when they leave, see where they're going. The white tern, South Pacific island bird that feeds at sea, meaning that it lives on land, unlike these other pelagic birds we've been seeing that are crossing vast expanses of ocean. This one leaves islands, goes out for a couple of days, and then goes back to the island again. If you could find one of those, he's going to take you back to land. Navigating by ocean swells. How are the swells hitting your canoe? This time of year, are there northern swells or are there southern swells? Are the swells coming out of the northwest at this time of the year? And swell patterns. When swells hit an island, it changes the pattern of the ocean. You get a wraparound effect. There's a lee in the back of that island. So on March the 8th, 1975, The first voyaging canoe to be built in the Hawaiian Islands in over 600 years was launched. Its name was Hokulea, one of the zenith stars, also known as Arcturus. This is her launch, pictures of her launch. And of course, the crew trained for the rigors of the journey. Every day, calisthenics, exercise, and of course, planned sails around the island with much fanfare. It's said that the sailors sailed around the islands to train, and people would sit and watch as if looking at an old friend, for they remembered. And what they found out was, how did I miss that? Yeah. The Hokulea left Hawaii on May the 1st, 1976, for Tahiti in an attempt to retrace the ancient voyaging route with Micronesian navigator Mau Peluk using absolutely no instruments. Now, Mau did not train the sailors how to navigate. He simply trained them for the rigors of the sail, how to operate the vessel, how to trim the sails, and how to act like a team. That was his goal. He was to do the navigation. And they found that scientists and sailors don't mix. They had a mix of the two on board. They had Hawaiians on board who were going for cultural reasons, that had trained for the rigors of being sailors. And of course, they had scientists, anthropologists, and oceanographers who were taking samples and testing. And then, of course, someone there to transcribe the entire journey. And they found out that this didn't work out very well. They had a 2,500-mile journey. And this is what this is where they sat for the entire journey. You can imagine this would be a little bit cramped and smelly, no showers, no soap. And there were a few punches thrown as well during the voyage. Now, I spent 78 days with my husband on a 23-foot fishing vessel going across the United States, retracing the route of Lewis and Clark, the first female to do it from Pittsburgh to Astoria, Oregon. And I can tell you that we almost were divorced 3 times in the 78 days. So I can't even imagine. And we had a little cabin. It was only as long as I am, but we had a little cabin. These guys couldn't get away from each other. And they certainly couldn't swim away. They would never find the guy again, right? So different motivators and objectives in a really small space didn't work out. But they arrived in Tahiti after 31 days on June the 3rd, 1976. Now, this ship sails to Tahiti. Normally, we're changing our itinerary and going to the east coast of North America. But I've been to this beach and marveled at this, what must have been an amazing event, as all these people came to see this fantastic journey that had just culminated on their shores. People couldn't see, so they climbed into the trees. It was a spontaneous and innate reaction by a people who had maintained their language and their genealogy and who understood who their great navigators were. They knew about the great canoes, but they did not have such a canoe. So when Hokulea entered the bay, she was a powerful symbol that reminded them of the greatness of their culture and their heritage, and therefore of themselves. 17,000 people came down, over half the population of the island. The canoe got to the black sand beach, and so many children got on it that it sank the stern. It was the beginning of a cultural revival and the renewal of the Polynesian people. The Hokulea breathed life into all the hopes and legends about ancient seafaring. The pathway to Tahiti had been reopened, and something long dormant began to stir in the hearts and the minds of all Polynesians. There's Mao and the crew being greeted, of course, fanfare. Now, The mystery was solved. To academia, Mao's achievement provided evidence for intentional two-way voyaging throughout Oceania, supporting the hypothesis that explained the Asiatic origins of the Polynesians. However, look at this picture. Look at Mao's face. He's not happy. He actually left his team and flew back home to Satawal. They had to figure out how to get back home. He left him a tape-recorded message, and he said, I'll never sail with you again. I asked you to do one thing, to work as a team, to work in unity. That's what's required of you to sail. You don't understand the customs that I'm trying to pass on. Therefore, I'm done. So, they go back home. This was one of the team members, Nanoa Thompson, navigator now. He came home, and if you've ever heard the stories of the Apollo missions, the first men to go into space, they worked so hard on a goal that was basically thrust upon them in a very short period of time to accomplish one of the world's greatest achievements, and then you come back home to Cheerio breakfasts. Many of them suffered from Great Depression, because what are you going to do after that? This is what happened to the crew of the Hokulea. Their entire ancestry and heritage and culture rested on that voyage. They reawakened their people, and they came back home to Cheerios. What are you going to do? So they were all, needless to say, extremely disappointed in themselves. Now they had nothing. They didn't learn navigation. They didn't have Mao. And he, their teacher, if you've ever had a great teacher that's disappointed in you, is about the greatest heartbreak you can possibly have. So Nanoa decides, you know what? We will completely deflate the Hawaiian people if we do not keep this going. And he says, we have to do it again. We've got to figure out how to get out there. And we don't know how to do the navigation, but we need to sail the Hokulea again. Just to keep this energy going, and we'll figure out the rest later. So 2 years later, they assembled another team. They got the crew together, and they attempted to take another trip to Tahiti on their own. They thought they had enough information, they could do this. So everyone prepared for this fantastic journey again, a new younger crop of sailors, young kids they'd recruited. And one of them was Eddie Aikau. Now this was Hawaii's son. He was the very first native Hawaiian who was allowed to be a lifeguard. He was the very first native Hawaiian allowed to surf the big waves in the competitions. And he won. He was really good. He was a fantastic waterman, one of 10 children that lived on a graveyard site. His parents upkept the cemetery. And he was chosen as a crew member. Of course, he's a great waterman. So they got this crew of men and women, and they set out to make this voyage again. Young people, train them to become the voyagers. They looked at the weather forecast, and there was a storm coming. Now, sailors know you don't take risks. If there's an option to wait, you wait. But there was fanfare. The governor was there. There were hula chants going on, hula dancing going on. You know, everyone's families had flown in from all over to see this great voyage. Of 2 years it took to assemble this team and try again. And so they left anyway. They took off into the storm on the Hokulea to make another voyage. As they left, 2 hours later, unfortunately, 12 miles off the coast of Molokai, the canoe flipped. They were without communications. They had a surfboard on board. So they waited. No one followed them. So they waited and waited. And after spending the night in rough seas in a storm on the top of an upside-down canoe, about 24 hours later, Eddie said, I'll go. I'll take this surfboard, I'll paddle back to the mainland, and I'll get us help. And they said, Eddie's too dangerous. He's the waterman. He's the first lifeguard, big wave surfer. He decided he was going. So he left, paddled out, and Eddie was never seen again. 72 hours after the capsizing of the Hokulea, a commercial plane spotted the wreckage and called it into the Coast Guard, and everyone was rescued after spending 3 nights in a storm on top of an upside-down canoe. Everyone went out looking for Eddie. Everyone who had a vessel of any sort went out looking for him. He was on a red surfboard, very bright colored. And after about 2 weeks of searching, his father, a very meek man, got in front of the television newscasters and said, please stop. Eddie's gone. He's now part of the story of the Hokulea. We must move on. You may have seen some bumper stickers in Hawaii, some t-shirts or billboards that says, Eddie would go. That's what that refers to. So the search was called off again. Everyone comes home and is completely deflated. Back to Cheerios. What are we going to do? Nanoa feels completely responsible. And they've lost one of Hawaii's sons in the process. So he says, I don't know. We're going to figure this out. Back on Satawal, Mao still has no one to teach this craft to. He has some young sons, 6 of them actually. 5 of them have gone off to university, have no interest whatsoever in learning the old ways of building canoes and learning navigation. He's got 1 6-year-old left, Caesar. Mao was feeling like he had not finished what he started with the Hawaiians and was extremely disappointed, of course, himself. He wasn't able to share his secret knowledge beyond his shores. And now there were only 6 master navigators left in Micronesia. So Nanoa does what any good boy would do, asks his dad what to do. His dad says, you got to do this. But if you want to do it, you have to do it right. And you're going to have to go back to the source. You're going to have to go back to Mao and get him to show you this time what he knows. And you are going to become the master. So, Nanoa goes back to Satawal, literally hits the shores, gets down on his knees and crawls to Mao's hut and lays on the floor in front of him and says, I'm sorry. I'm sorry we disappointed you. We don't want you to find Tahiti for us, but we want you to come back and help us find Tahiti for ourselves. Because that, after all, is what this is all about. And he agreed. He came back to Hawaii and trained Nanoa for 2 years, just on navigation, celestial navigation, using all of the swells, reading the way that the swells wrap around the islands, reading the swells and the currents, tasting the seawater. You can taste the difference in salinity. There's rivers coming from an island and running through a current. Tasting that. Subtleties we have no comprehension of. So 2 years later, in 1980, Thompson replicated the successful 1976 voyage to Tahiti, becoming the first modern Hawaiian to master the art of Micronesian navigation. He did it. After that successful voyage, this spawned the training of new navigators and the construction of new voyaging canoes across French Polynesia. Everybody wanted to have a canoe. Everyone wanted to learn this old technique, a new way. They had lost the Polynesian navigators. But now at least they had the Micronesian navigation system. Now there are 5 other voyaging canoes in Hawaii. Some have sailed with the Hokulea. This resulted in the revival of Polynesian navigating and canoe building in Hawaii, New Zealand, Rarotonga, Tahiti, and also sparked an interest in traditional wayfinding on Mao's home island of Satawal. The Hokulea has been sailing since 1976. She just finished a voyage around the world, and she's now planning to circumnavigate the entire Pacific Ocean, touching all of the continents. She even came through the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, after the voyage, Mao became ill. He had diabetes. And there are not dialysis centers on Satawal. So he decided to move himself to Hawaii, get treatments, to come for homeopathic treatments and for dialysis. He stayed in Hawaii for a while. He enjoyed speaking engagements, meeting people from all over the islands who, of course, thanked him and adored him. But about 2 years passed, and he decided that he needed to go home and die peacefully there. As he went home to finish off his life, some of the sailors who were involved in building the Hokulea and in the missions of sailing got together and decided that they would like to build a voyaging canoe for Mao. They did not have such a canoe where he lived, which were all hand-dug canoes, not beautiful fiberglass with gorgeous sails like the Hokulea. So they got together, they fundraised for 5 years, collecting money to build this canoe, and they all worked on it. They wanted to teach a whole new generation of Micronesian seafarers the art of navigation. And of course, they expected nothing in return because they had gotten so much. They named it the Maisu. They sailed it for 45 days to Satawal. The Hokulea accompanied the Maisu as an escort boat. When they arrived, of course, they were greeted with fanfare. They had not been yet. The people of Satawal had only heard these stories. They came out with their signs, and Mao held a po. Now, this is the highest honor for any navigator. It's the to be named Master Navigators. And by this time, Nanoa and his son, Cesar, had become Master Navigators. There's his son. Papa Mao, as he became known with great reverence and affection, received an honorary degree from the University of Hawaii, and he was honored by the Smithsonian Institution and the Bishop Museum for his contributions to maritime history. Mao's life and work was explored in several books and documentary films, and his legacy continues to be remembered and celebrated by the indigenous peoples of Oceania. The greatest human adventure story of all time had been revealed, and the Polynesian navigation culture revised. The people of these islands remembered who they were and have pride in their history, and the Hokulea and the people who dared to dream of her, build her and sailed her, changed the world forever. So as Nanoa was leaving Satawal, which he knew would be for the last time he would see his teacher, as he tells the story, he says, he had a hard time leaving, of course, to say goodbye to someone so important in the world and in your life for the last time. So he kind of walked away, got down to the boat, and turned around and came back, and he said, how can I ever thank you, to tell you how much all of this means to me? There's no words to describe my gratitude and what you've done for the world. And he said, in teaching navigation to others, I'll always be with you. So Nanoa returned to Hawaii and still teaches.
Hawaii's pride, she sails with the wind, and proud are we to see her sail free. Feelings deep and so strong for Hoku. Hokulea for Hoku. Hokulea. Stars that shine to guide her straight path across the sea, down to Tahiti, then back to Hawaii. She sails for Hoku. Hokulea for Hoku. Hokulea.
Mahalo nui loa. Thank you very much.